Okay, coming to you live from the 6th floor of the Hiawatha. It is the System Failure Podcast, number 8.
Hey, Brian, how are you doing this week?
Well, pretty good. So, like Jesus himself, we've died and been reborn from the ashes because we have a brand new podcasting rig here.
Ugh, yeah, we lost another episode. This is the second one, just to technical issues. And, I mean, we've got full-time jobs, and I'm writing a Substack, and so we didn't really have time to put another podcast in the works this week, so we missed a week for the first time ever, much to my, and I'm sure your enduring shame, Brian.
Well, I felt like the last podcast was a banger too.
I know, it was the worst. So in my mind, we've got to redo the content from last week's pod, and I've got new ideas for this week. So we've got way too much to get to in a short amount of time, which is a good problem to have, ultimately, I suppose. Well, first we have to mention this beautiful new podcast equipment you've bought here. We really, Brian, you really spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars and substantially upgraded the quality of this rig. I can't believe how great I sound in my own ears.
Yeah, well, we were crowded around one USB mic before. It was extremely primitive. And well, now we actually have headphones, and we can hear each other in each other's headphones.
Yeah, and a mixer and real equipment. This is awesome.
All right. Well, I guess we'll get into it this way. Well, we got some, listener feedback from my friend Jonathan, and he sent me this video from this guy Mike Winger, who I guess is like some kind of fancies himself as some kind of biblical scholar. It seems like he talks about the Bible and is into it and stuff. And so he was saying that, what is espoused in Zeitgeist. And also, I forgot that Bill Maher in Religulous talks about it again. But it's that, Mithra and Dionysus and Horus, are all supposed to be born on, December 25th and of a virgin and have 12 disciples. Or at least this is what they say in Zeitgeist and Religulous. And so this guy was saying that is not the case. And if you do some Googling, it seems like there's conflicting information on the internet as to whether this is actually the case. And so, Nate, I understand that, you've obviously, we've explored Dionysus in the past, and I guess you have some opinions about this kind of thing, huh?
Yeah, well, I think my first point on this one would be there is no question that Jesus is a continuation with Dionysus. That is, I don't think, disputed by any serious scholar. You have to get into the religious crazies to get to people who want to pretend that Dionysus and Jesus aren't copied from each other. Here's a good for example. The Gospel of John. Obviously, we understand that that Christianity is a Greek religion. The New Testament was written in Greek. And the Gospel of John is lifted from this play called The Bacchae by Euripides. Euripides being one of the most famous Greek playwrights from back in the day. If you go to Athens and you visit the Acropolis, there is pushed up against the side of the Acropolis, as everyone knows, is this city with the Parthenon. It's the Acropolis means city up high, and up there is where the Parthenon is. And there's a few other buildings too, like something called the Erechtheion. But the Parthenon, and there used to be a huge statue of Athena up there too, which is the patron goddess of Athens and where the city gets his name. Now that statue's long been lost, and the truth is the Parthenon was blown up too in a war between the Turks and the Doge of Venice. The Doge launched a cannonball, and it went into the inner sanctuary of the Parthenon where the Turks had stored their arsenal and all their gunpowder, and it exploded and knocked over all the columns of the Parthenon. The thing had to be reassembled. But the point is that nestled against the Parthenon is this theater of Dionysus. You can still go visit it to this day. And this is where this play, The Bacchae, was first performed. It actually was performed after Euripides' death, but it became central to Athenian culture. And the play is about shockingly a resurrected God, and has all of these parallels. The Gospel of John is according to Brian Murarescu, is kind of a code. The Roman government in 186 BC cracked down on the Dionysian cult, and so it became illegal and underground. And for that reason, the cultists had to kind of change the sign on the door slyly. And so the Gospel of John is is a big. It's a big. Anyone who was the Greek diaspora, and that's to say Greek settlers who lived all around the Mediterranean basin, would have gotten this Gospel of St. John and been like, "Oh, I see what this is. This is the same play as from the Dionysia festival. This is the Bacchae by Euripides because it's got the same stories, like Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana. Well, that's Dionysus turning water into wine at a wedding in the Bacchae. So there's a continuity there.
So the water into wine story is not in any of the other Gospels, then?
Correct. It is only in the Gospel of John. Some stories, like Jesus chucking the moneylenders out the temple, is in all 4 Gospels, but only in John will you find this story of the wedding at Cana.
I mean, interesting. That's obviously a major thing that people talk about when they talk about Jesus is turning water into wine.
It's a trademark move, and it was a trademark move for Dionysus before it was a trademark move for Jesus. So this is a rabbit hole you can go. Dionysus had long hair. He was a long-haired hippie sort of guy, and that's because he was a hermaphroditic god in the very beginning. And so what I propose to read to you now is a couple of quotes from my favorite historian, Will Durant. And he's got away with words, so these will be some fun quotes. And the first quote will be it will make a continuity between the festival at Eleusis, the mysteries at Eleusis, where the psychedelic potion was drank, and the Dionysia festival that became the trademark for Athens. And then the second one will make a connection between Dionysus and Jesus. So you'll be able to trace a continuity here. And when I'm done, I'll have a third quote from my favorite economist, Michael Hudson, talking about the transition from Eleusinian mysteries, which was exclusive to the upper class, and the Dionysian festival, which was also based on Dionysus, of course, is the god of wine and intoxication. And so the Dionysian festival was really the everyman, the regular Joe, taking the secrets of Eleusis that used to be just for the upper class and liberating it for everyone. This is where you get these open air, still pictures of Jesus in open air churches. In an open air church, he'll be preaching to his congregation. You'll see it on every illustration of the New Testament. He'll be outside preaching to his people who are all sitting around and listening intently to what he's saying. And oftentimes Jesus will have a sheep on his lap. Jesus has sheep and lamb, but Dionysus had goats. And so that's kind of Dionysus' symbol was the goat. His companions are satyrs who have goat legs, from the waist down. They're goats. So just keep all that in mind while I regale you with the following quotes. So again, this first one is going to be about Eleusis and Dionysus. And so Will Durant is going to set the stage for us here. Quote, "One of the most beautiful of Greek myths, skillfully narrated in the hymn to Demeter, once attributed to Homer, tells how Demeter's daughter Persephone, while gathering flowers, was kidnapped by Pluto, god of the underworld, and snatched down to Hades. The sorrowing mother searched for her everywhere, found her, and persuaded Pluto to let Persephone live on the earth 9 months in every year, a pretty symbol for the annual death and rebirth of the soil. Because the people of Eleusis befriended the disguised Demeter, as she, quote, sat by the way, grieved in her innermost heart, unquote, she taught them and Attica the secret of agriculture." Just as this is me now, Attica is the region where Athens is located, so is the broader region. "She taught them in Attica the secret of agriculture and sent Triptolemus, son of Eleusis' king, to spread the art among mankind. Essentially, it was the same myth as that of Isis and Osiris in Egypt, Tammuz and Ishtar in Babylonia, Astarte and Adonis in Syria, Cybele and Attis in Phrygia. The cult of motherhood survived through classical times to take new life in the worship of Mary, the Mother of God. In the Greek sense, a mystery was a secret ceremony in which sacred symbols were revealed, symbolic rites were performed, and only initiates were worshippers. Usually the rites represented or commemorated in semi-dramatic form the suffering, death, and resurrection of a god, pointed back to old vegetation themes in magic, and promised the initiate a personal immortality. Many places in Greece celebrated such mystic rites, but no other place in this respect could rival Eleusis. The mysteries there would be of pre-Achaean origin and appear to have been originally an autumn festival of plowing and sowing. A myth explained how Demeter, rewarding the people of Attica for their kindness to her in her wanderings, established at Eleusis her greatest temple, which was destroyed and rebuilt many times during the history of Greece. Under Solon, Pisistratus, and Pericles, the founder of Demeter, the festival of Demeter at Eleusis was adopted by Athens and raised to higher elaboration and pomp. In the lesser mysteries held near Athens in the spring, candidates for initiation underwent a preliminary purification by self-immersion in the waters of the Eleusis. In September, the candidates and others walked in grave but happy pilgrimage for 14 miles along the sacred way to Eleusis, bearing at their head the image of the Scythulian deity Aeacus. The procession arrived at Eleusis under torchlight and solemnly placed the image in the temple, after which the day was ended and with sacred dances and songs. The greater mysteries lasted 4 days more. Those who had been purified with bathing and fasting were now admitted to the lesser rites. Those who had received such rites a year before were taken into the hall of initiation, where the secret ceremony was performed. The mystai, or initiates, broke their fast by participating in a holy communion in memory of Demeter, drinking a holy mixture of meal and water, and eating sacred cakes. What mystic ritual was then performed, we do not know. The secret was well kept throughout antiquity under penalty of death. Even the pious Aeschylus narrowly escaped condemnation for certain lines that might have given the secret away. The ceremony was, in any case, a symbolic play, and had a part in generating the Dionysian drama. Very probably the theme was the rape of Persephone by Pluto, the sorrowful wandering of Demeter, the return of the maiden to earth, and the revelation of agriculture to Attica. The summary of the ceremony was the mystic marriage of a priest representing Zeus with a priestess impersonating Demeter. These symbolic nuptials bore fruit with magic speed, for it was soon followed, we are told, by a solemn announcement that Our Lady has born a holy boy. This is me talking again. We should be noticing about 4 or 5 different tie-ins to Christianity already here. And this idea of the birth of the Holy Child is just one of those parallels. Our Lady has born a holy boy, unquote, and a reaped ear of corn was exhibited as symbolizing the fruit of Demeter's labor, the bounty of the fields. The worshippers were then led by dim torchlight into dark subterranean caverns symbolizing Hades, and again to an upper chamber brilliant with light, representing, it appears, the abode of the blessed. And they were now shown in solemn exaltation, the objects, relics, or icons that, till that moment, had been concealed. In this ecstasy of revelation, we are assured, they felt the unity of God and the oneness of God in the soul. They were lifted up out of the delusion of individuality and knew the peace of absorption into deity. In the age of Pisistratus, the mysteries of Dionysus entered into the Eleusinian liturgy by religious infection. The god Aeacus was identified with Dionysus as the son of Persephone, and the legend of Dionysus Zagreus was superimposed upon the myth of Demeter. But through all forms, the basic idea of the mysteries remained the same. As the seed is born again, so may the dead have renewed life, and not merely the dreary, shadowy existence of Hades, but a life of happiness and peace. When almost everything else in Greek religion had passed away, this consoling hope reunited in Alexandria with the Egyptian belief in immortality from which the Greeks had derived, gave to Christianity the weapon with which to conquer the Western world. So that's quote number 1, and that really gives you the whole rundown of what was going on at Eleusis. Now, keep in mind, Will Durant and his wife Ariel were writing this in the 30s. They had no idea that there was psychedelic drugs at Eleusis. That discovery didn't come till 2003, and we didn't get it in the English-speaking world till 2020 when the aforementioned Brian Moraresky wrote his book, The Immortality Key. There is actual archaeological evidence that ergot was what was being consumed there. We have that now, but it's amazing that Will Durant is able to zero in on ego death, when he's talking about being lifted up out of the delusion of individuality, which is incredible to me that he was able to divine that without any knowledge of the psychedelics. Keep in mind, LSD was synthesized in the 1930s, so Durant is writing that around the same time that Albert Hofmann is first synthesizing LSD from ergot in Switzerland. So it's amazing. What did you think about that quote, Brian?
Well, What are we saying the parallels here are between Dionysus and Jesus? I mean, obviously, so Jesus is like born of the marriage of Zeus and Persephone. Is that right?
Yeah, eventually, and that'll be the next quote. We'll get directly to the connection between Dionysus and Jesus in the next quote. But that one is really just setting up the themes of death and rebirth, the idea of a holy communion, and the idea of a holy child, and also the idea of ego, death, and resurrection, which is something that the church has since lost, but was an important part of these ancient religions.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it does sound like a fascinating ritual. So they brought the people like into these rooms, and they'd go to like the room of Hades, and then go to the room of light or whatever, and then they'd have the ego death.
Yeah. There was something called the Telestrion, which is a big temple. I've sat on the steps of the Telestrion. But the thing that's funny about Eleusis, it sits right on the edge of the vast grain fields, the vast plains that fed Athens. And so it's very agriculturally minded. And so it makes sense that the thing that they would have been drinking, the communion they would have been drinking, it wouldn't have been bread from it necessarily, but it would have been a beer made from cereal grains and barley or something. And the other thing that's at Eleusis is that just because of the geography, there are these weird crevices in the rock. Like it's porous. You're with it. This now is a port where like ships come and dock. It's like you're right there on the waterfront. And so the obviously you've got that porous sort of bedrock, and so there are these weird caves that you can kind of see in. They're really creepy looking, and that supposedly is the path to hell that Persephone got dragged down into. And people still leave pomegranates to this day. There's like pomegranates left on the ledges there. Pomegranates being, of course, the symbol of Persephone. The story goes that when she was in hell and her mom came for her, the idea is if you eat anything in hell, you're doomed. You have to stay there forever. But she, even after her rape, Persephone kind of liked her new role as queen of the underworld. So she, on the DL, ate 3 of those pomegranate seeds. And so because she ate the 3 seeds, she has to return to hell 3 months out of every year. And that's how we explain the seasons. The plants forget to grow and they kind of die. That's Demeter. Demeter's the one that makes the plants grow. So she's sad. Her daughter's back in hell again. And that's why we get the winter. So this is the story, and so you can see why the death and rebirth it fits with the ego death that comes with psychedelic drugs, and it also fits with agriculture, with the crops. You owe your life to agriculture, and in the sense of debts and finance, you also have to allow debts to die. That is, you have to have debt forgivenesses. Now that's not really. Well, when I get to my Michael Hudson quote, it actually is true that debt has a little something to do with this. But debt has a lot to do with it once you get into the Hebrew tradition of debt forgiveness that they got from the Babylonians. That was just the thing that Roman society needed to avoid collapse, and that's why Jesus is talking so much about debt forgiveness. So, so many crossroads. That the reality of Eleusis is so dense and thick. There's so many different things that interact with so many billiard balls colliding here. It's hard to keep track of them all.
Well, I mean, it does seem to, I guess, support the sun worship narrative espoused in the Zeitgeist movie there.
Yeah, the sun is the most. When you think about the idea of death and rebirth, the sun is the most obvious allegory there is, right? You've got the daily cycle. The sun goes up, the sun goes down, the sun comes up again the next day, and this is indeed what the Egyptian religion symbolized. The sun in the morning is symbolized by Horus, and the sun at noontime symbolized by the father Osiris, and the sun in the evening characterized by the god of death, Set. We still call it a sunset to this day. We still call it the horizon or the horoscope. Right? It's like, this is a Horus from ancient Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. So obviously, death and rebirth from Egypt is a huge part of both the worship of Demeter, of Dionysus, and of Jesus.
All right. Well, should we get on to quote number 2 here?
And I think quote number 2 is a little shorter, and I think folks will be relieved to hear that. But here is Will Durant now talking about Dionysus and Jesus. Before I get started, let me just say this is a little gory towards the bottom, so like trigger warning, whatever. But that's the reality of the Dionysian cult. Okay, quote, only late in his career was Dionysus received into Olympus. In Thrace, which gave him as a Greek gift to Greece, he was the god of liquor brewed from barley and was known as Sabazius. In Greece, he became a god of wine, the nourisher and guardian of the vine. He began as a goddess of fertility, became a god of intoxication, and ended up as a son of God dying to save mankind. Things should be sounding familiar already. Many figures and legends were mingled to make his myth. The Greeks thought of him as Zagreus, the horned child born to Zeus by his daughter Persephone. He was the best beloved of his father and was seated beside him in the throne of heaven. When the jealous Hera incited the Titans to kill him, Zeus, to disguise him, changed him into a goat and then a bull. In this form, nevertheless, the Titans captured him, cut his body into pieces, and boiled them in a cauldron. Athena, like another Trelawney, saved the heart and carried it to Zeus. Zeus gave it to Semele, who, impregnated with it, gave the god a second birth under the name Dionysus. Mourning for Dionysus' death and joyful celebration of his resurrection formed the basis of a ritual extremely widespread among the Greeks. In the springtime, when the vine was bursting into blossom, Greek women went up to the hills and met with the reborn god. For 2 days they drank without restraint, and, like our less religious Bacchanalians, considered him witless who would not lose his wits. They marched in wild procession, led by maenads or mad women devoted to Dionysus. They listened tensely to the story they knew so well of the suffering, death, and resurrection of their god. As they drank and danced, they fell into a frenzy in which all bonds were loosed. The height and center of their ceremony was to seize upon a goat, a bull, sometimes a man, seeing in them incarnations of their god, and to tear the live victim to pieces in commemoration of Dionysus' dismemberment, and then to drink the blood and eat the flesh in a sacred communion, whereby, as they thought, the god would enter them and possess their souls. In that divine enthusiasm, they were convinced that they and the god became one in a mystic and triumphant union. They took his name, called themselves after one of his titles, Bakoi, and knew that now they would never die. Or they termed their state an ecstasis, a going out of their souls to meet and be one with Dionysus. Thus, they felt freed from the burden of the flesh. They acquired divine insight and were able to prophesy they were gods. Such was the passionate cult that came down from Thrace into Greece like a medieval epidemic of religion, dragging one region after another from the cold and clear Olympians of state worship into a faith in ritual that satisfied the craving for excitement and release, the longing for enthusiasm and possession, mysticism and mystery. The priests of Delphi and the ruler of Athens tried to keep the cult at a distance but failed. All they could do was adopt Dionysus into Olympus, Hellenize and humanize him, give him an official festival, and turn the revelry of his worshippers into the mad ecstasy of wine among the hills. And turn the revelry of his worshippers from the mad ecstasy of wine among the hills into the stately processions, the robust songs, and the noble drama of the great Dionysia. For a while they won Dionysus over to Apollo, but in the end Apollo yielded to Dionysus' heir and conqueror Christ. That's the end of the quote, and that's Will Durant, which is fascinating. Again, we're seeing this idea of communion, of consuming the flesh or blood of a god. You heard with Sabazius the idea of the barley drink, of course Dionysus is famous for his wine. And I think I should pause and mention here that when we talk about wine, when we talk about Dionysus' wine, we are not talking about Merlot that you have from your dinner table. The wine was a mixer for the Greeks. They would mix in all kinds of other ingredients. There is a story about Alexander the Great drinking wine in celebration, I think of his birthday or something, far away from Macedonia. At this celebration, people, according to accounts, people died from the wine. So we're not talking about regular wine here. One other note: there was this guy Dioscorides, and he wrote a 5-volume compendium of what all of the. It was a pharmacopoeia. What do all of the herbs and plants in the forest do? What kind of effects do they have? And this pharmacopoeia was authoritative right up until the time of the Renaissance. We relied on it for a long time. And the point I wish to make about this pharmacopoeia is that the 5th volume is entirely devoted to wines mixed with other stuff, hallucinogens like henbane. So these guys, when they say wine, they don't just mean grapes. They mean crazy drugs. And I think if the continuity between Eleusis and Dionysus alluded to by Will Durant is any indicator, it's likely to be the same kind of intoxicant they had at Eleusis, and that's likely to be ergot, the very same mushroom that grows on cereal grains that gave rise to the Salem witch trials and from which Albert Hofmann first synthesized LSD in the 30s.
All right, so these are both Will Durant quotes, right?
Correct, yes.
Okay, and now, so they're talking about two different communion. Are they talking about like a communion like the one that happened like later in Greece compared to the one that happened earlier?
Yep. This all started with, in the beginning, only the rich went to Eleusis and observed the mysteries there. But eventually, the mystery was liberated. Will Durant mentioned Achilles. Achilles was an Eleusis townie. He grew up there, and he was a playwright too, just like Euripides was. And he wrote a play about the goings on at Eleusis, and he, according to Will Durant, included a few too many lines, a few too many details, and that brought him before the court, where he, I guess, got acquitted. But that's a serious legal charges, revealing the mysteries. I think the name they called it profaning the mysteries. Another guy, the statesman, a famous one, Alcibiades. This guy makes an appearance in the Assassin's Creed Odyssey game. That guy did get banished from Athens for taking the mystery and using it in his own house to amuse house guests. So it was not. It wasn't. Death was like the penalty if you weren't careful for revealing these mysteries. But of course, something as great as psychedelic drugs can't remain hidden forever. And so now I've got about that. I've got a little quote from Michael Hudson, and this is a much shorter quote. But this is, but Michael Hudson suggests that the liberation of the secret from Eleusis was part of a larger class war. And so I'll read you this quote, and then we'll talk about how Christianity is also about a class war, right? The exaltation of the poor over the rich. But here's the quote: "When Solon of Athens and Sparta's semi-mythical Lycurgus liberated their populations from debt bondage, they did so as authors of a new civic order, not as drawing on an ancient covenant. Solon's successors, the Pisistratids, sponsored social reforms as secular leaders by building up the Dionysus festival and Homeric recitations as counterweights to the Eleusinian religion controlled by the old aristocratic families." That tells the story right there, I think. You find, even in the transition from Eleusis to Dionysus, you find the conflict between rich and poor, and that's another great theme of Christianity.
And so they started calling Eleusis Dionysus, but Dionysus is also the name of the god, right?
There's a couple different Dionysuses. There's this thing called syncretism where gods end up getting mixed together. Not real. That's what we're talking about. Like Jesus comes from Dionysus. Dionysus comes from Eleusis. But the location was always Eleusis. It's right next to Athens. And the gods involved in the ceremony at first were just Demeter and Persephone, and then eventually they introduced after the Dionysian cult, after the rise of the Dionysian cult, the political authorities incorporated Dionysus into the Eleusis festival, trying to stay relevant. If you go to the Acropolis Museum, there's a plaque which I actually have a picture of. I can read it. And that plaque notes that Dionysus was the most popular god in ancient Greece, and it's no mystery why, right? If the man has like crazy drugs, well, of course he's going to be popular. So I have here. There's a display that shows a model of the old theater of Dionysus, what it would look like when it was new, and this is from the Acropolis Museum, and the placard above the theater of Dionysus reads thus: "Dionysus, the god of vegetation, wine, inebriation, and ecstatic dance, was the most popular deity in ancient Greece. His symbols were the thyrsus, a branch of ivy leaves, or a magic wand, the cantharos cup, grapevines, theatrical masks, and the phallus. His companions were Maenads, Satyrs, and Silene. The god's most important sanctuary was located here on the southern slope of the Acropolis. The Athenians celebrated the great city Dionysia, one of the city's most important festivals, which took place in the month of Elaphevelion in early spring. The Athenian cult rituals in honor of Dionysus gradually gave birth to drama and led to the establishment of drama competitions. The large theater that was located above the sanctuary was the first to host the plays of the most significant ancient tragic and comic playwrights: Achilles, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes." And we already talked about Achilles and Euripides. So very, very interesting stuff there. To note that the worship of Dionysus gave birth to drama in the theater as we know it is really mind-blowing. It does make sense that psychedelic drugs would be if you're having ego death, you realize that your identity is nothing but a costume that you wear. And you can see why experiencing ego death would give rise to this idea of the theater, where you put on the costume of other personas and act out as if you're them. It's related to the idea of being possessed by a god. Enthusiasm means being imbued by theos. Enthusiasm means being, consumed by the god. When Carl Ruck, the Harvard archaeologist went to give a term to these kind of drugs that are religious in nature. He called them entheogens, and that's still the word that we use today.
Well, I mean, you can imagine that the drama had to be born at some point, and so I mean, obviously, it was born in Greece.
Yeah.
And you can see how, the cult of Dionysus or whatever would give birth to that.
So I suppose my general response to your man Jonathan's note is we wouldn't want to get hung up on specifically December the 25th. There's a lot of other similarities between Jesus. If you don't like that one with Dionysus and you just want to leave December 25th to Mithra, I think it's true to say that the sun gods are always born on the winter solstice, generally speaking. But Dionysus was not really he wasn't just a sun god like Horus or Osiris. He was so much more than that. And so you might, and there's so many different versions of Dionysus. So I wouldn't worry too much if you can find evidence of this or that version of Dionysus not being born on December the 25th. You've still got Mithra, whose symbol is also the bull, and who's definitely born on December the 25th. So it's really, you don't want to get too bogged down, I suppose, in a detail like that. There is no question that Jesus is a copy of previous deities. Like, good one is the legend goes, one legend of Dionysus goes that that Zeus accidentally killed his mom, of course, and so he took the unborn fetus of Dionysus and cut open his own thigh and put the fetus of Dionysus in there to let Dionysus kind of mature and let his bread rise, let him come to term, and then he was born out of Zeus. I think the original Greek would suggest that the original Greek reading of the New Testament says that Jesus sits at the side of God or at the right hand of God or on the lap of God. But the original Greek word kolpon, Kolpon, really means the thigh. I think that's correct. So the coincidences and the similarities are dizzying when you really start drilling down into it.
Well, I didn't do a crazily deep dive on this guy Mike Winger, who is the author of these ideas that Jesus is not a replication of Dionysus. But I mean, I guess he's some kind of biblical scholar in that if Jesus being a continuation of the sun god story is like a threat to your narrative, you'll look for information to support your point of view. And there's a lot of information out there, so it's hard to parse out the truth. So, I don't know, maybe, if Mike Winger heard this and responded, he'd have something to say. But obviously, it seems like there's a lot of compelling evidence that, Jesus is a continuation of the sun god. And, with being born on December 25th and whatnot, and, the ideas that they talk about in Zeitgeist, where you got the three stars of Orion's belt and Sirius pointing at the point where the sun rises on December 25th. I mean, it seems like obviously there's something going on there. So it would kind of be crazy if he didn't have connection to these other sun gods.
In my main thesis on my Substack, there's a computer program you can use to model the sky, and so I put in I think I did December the 24th year zero, and then December the 25th year zero, and you can clearly see the brightest star in the sky, Sirius. The three stars of Orion's belt, they seem to point directly at this bright star Sirius, and that's where the sun rises. And I believe it's on the vernal equinox, so the spring equinox. The sun rises, right where those three stars point to on the vernal equinox. There's some mashing together of the idea of Jesus' death and resurrection and his birth. He is dead, and he's dead for 3 days because the sun appears to stop moving south in the sky for 3 days around the time of the winter solstice. But his actual resurrection is in the spring when the fertility rites are. You have to be able to draw a bead on a lot of moving targets here to keep track of everything. Yeah.
Well, I want to kind of get into what we lost in our missing podcast from last time. And, so what we were talking about is that the idea of Jesus was like the perfect enemy to the Roman state. This idea, because they were like the arbiters. Their power came from their religion, and saying that this man had been risen from the dead was like an affront to the government, right?
Yeah, I always think of the famous Terence McKenna quote where he's talking about how the conversation at the dinner table around Rome during its golden era during the empire would have been a thoroughgoing modern conversation. They would be talking about things like democracy and atomism, the idea that reality is made of many small particles. The notion that someone could come back from the dead would have seemed like an ignorant superstition from the outer rim of the empire where the barbarians lived, the barbarians who supplied them with slaves. So you have these Romans who think of themselves as super smart and materialistic. That sounds like me in my 20s, by the way. Super smart and materialistic, and meanwhile the house help is like talking about has these wild tales of resurrection, and the T-Mac quote is, why don't they get it together and read a little Greek philosophy? Because they were Hebrew, and the Hebrew tradition was their tradition from Imperial Judea, or Imperial Palestine.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I guess it happens every once in a while where I guess these gods have to get co-opted into the government because, I guess people get materialistic and lose the mysticism or whatever. And so I guess it's happened a couple times, is what I gathered from your lengthy discussion from before.
You heard it from Will Durant. When Dionysus was taking over the Greek religion, the authorities in Athens and Delphi tried to resist it, but they had to give up in the end. They had to, it's kind of, you can't beat him, you got to join him. And oftentimes religion is used to prop up money-making schemes. Great example, in the Middle Ages, everyone just assumed that God wanted them to pay the church for forgiveness of their sins. It's like a belief. If you can get people to believe it, it's highly convenient from a money-making perspective. I think money comes into, or wealth, money, things like that come into the Roman Empire in the sense that you had exploding wealth inequality in Rome. The Roman Empire was built on expansion, and Will Durant has this quote that I love. In 198 BC, this is a contemporary source, conservative contemporary source, estimating in 198 BC that only 2,000 people owned property in the city of Rome, and that the population was 5 million. That's a crazy wealth concentration. And when you have a crazy wealth concentration like that, people become thirsty for something that's going to topple the authorities. The authorities are telling you this is the economic scoreboard. It's them 10 million and you 0. And you're like, I don't really want to keep playing this game. I would love a raft of ideas that would discredit these authorities. So I don't have to play this game anymore. And I think that's exactly what Christianity was. It was a torpedo, launched right at the heart of the authorities of Rome.
Yeah, and so I guess it's just interesting because, I wonder, what kind of torpedo could we shoot nowadays? We're once again super materialistic and basically lost the mysticism.
Massive wealth inequality, spiraling out of control. That too.
We probably need a new idea, but I don't know. See, it seems like it's basically the same story that keeps coming back, though. In Greece and in Rome and whatnot. So I don't know if it's just going to be the same idea somehow makes a comeback again.
Maybe, or maybe it'll be a whole new edition. Like maybe when you are when you live in maybe if you live in France in the 12th century and you see lights in the sky, that's the Virgin Mary. But maybe when you're in America in the 21st century and you see lights in the sky, that's an advanced sci-fi civilization, because our mythology is science fiction, right? That's our culture. That's how we understand things or interpret the world. Just to back up to Rome for a second before we get to the modern day, there's a thing where you have to understand that the Hebrew tradition came from the Babylonian tradition. In 598 BC, I think it was, Nebuchadnezzar sacks Jerusalem and hauls the Jews back to Babylon as his slaves, and then shortly thereafter, Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonians are sacked by Darius and the Persians, and Darius sends the Jews home back to Jerusalem, where Nehemiah reconsecrates the temple of Solomon that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. That's the second temple. The Romans would destroy that temple, of course, and I think it still hasn't been rebuilt. But the point here is that the Babylonians had this tradition of always forgiving debts periodically. And the reason they did that was because they wanted to, the kings of Babylon and the kings of Sumeria and the kings of Akkad, the kings of the Near East wanted to make sure that the scoreboard didn't get so crazy that people didn't want to play their economic game anymore. They, in other words, had to make sure that no rich people got so wealthy that they could challenge the king for power. So periodically, the king would reset the scoreboard so that society could continue forward. And if they didn't, then people would simply leave and go to another city state, right? If you like I was a student loan debtor, I had like 169K in student debt at one point. If I could just go to another city state where my slate said 0, I would definitely have done that. But the Greek and the Roman Empire particularly got so big that you really couldn't leave. Now they tried it. There was 3 or 4 of these incidents in the history of the early Roman Republic called the secession of the plebs, where people basically said, "We're not working anymore. This is so unequal. We're not working anymore. We are leaving." And the reason that happened, the reason that things got so bad in Greece and Rome, because these were the first democracies, right? There was no king that was going to be able to keep the rich people in check. So the rich people just exploited the hell out of the lower classes until the lower classes revolted. But there was nowhere for them to go. They have to eat. They couldn't leave Rome. It was the entire known world the Roman Empire was. And so that really led to, when you have that, the rich can pile up wealth and they did to a historical degree. But, of course, just like Icarus, the fall was proportional to the mound of gold they stacked up. And that's where Jesus comes in, waving around this crazy scroll of Isaiah. Isaiah is from the Old Testament, and it's one of the ones that talks about the debt forgiveness that the Jews learned about in Babylon. And Jesus is talking about how a forgiveness is the only way to avoid an eventual Armageddon, right? Forgiveness is the only way to salvation, the only way to avoid Armageddon. Now you can see how we got that message completely divorced from any economic meaning, right? By the time the Roman Empire, by the time the emperors of Rome became Christian, they had made the promise of salvation something that would come to you after you died. They put salvation over the horizon of death, where it couldn't affect their balance sheets, where they weren't going to have to do any debt forgivenesses in the here and now.
Well, I guess I feel conflicted. Well, there's it seems like terrible injustice that, like rich people have the game rigged up the way they do. It seems difficult to climb the economic ladder, I guess. On the other hand, though, I don't know. Like, I feel like I have a lot of locus of control over my life. And we are as Americans. I don't know. You could be a lot poorer. We're probably still are in the worldwide top 1%.
Definitely. Well, it's an interesting question. But look, think of it it doesn't mean that we definitely have it better than most people most of the time throughout history. No question about that. But the question is, are we able to? Is the economic logic of our civilization something we can carry into the future? We are going to, in 2022, we paid $500 billion on our outstanding. That's our national debt. The interest on that national debt was $500 billion. And now that the Fed has raised interest rates, the Congressional Budget Office expects to be paying 3 times that amount by 2032. So over the next decade, we're going to go from paying $500 billion a year in interest to $1.5 trillion a year. And so you're talking about in the next 10 years, you're going to have something like $10 trillion we, regular Joes, are going to owe to the rich people who buy treasury bonds. We don't have that kind of money. Right? At some point, we're going to have to say this debt cannot be paid. We're going to have to do something different. The money literally doesn't exist. The debt can never be paid. And we have the Roman legal system, which treats debt as sacrosanct. We don't have the tradition of debt forgiveness that all of the civilizations before Greece and Rome had. No matter how good we have it, the logic of compound interest is going to blow up our society at some point because there's nothing in the math that accounts for externalities like coming up against the limits of growth. And so, although you and I have it better than most, we are still going to see the gears of our society seize up. And it's going to happen sometime in the next 10 years, I think much sooner rather than later, because we don't have $10 trillion to give to the wealthy. They already have it all. And the more we go into hock to them, the more we go into debt to the rich, the more we owe them in interest payments. And so that's just a huge transfer of wealth from poor to rich that we cannot make.
See, I guess I feel like the rich people, as long as they have all the wealth, they don't really care if they're actually getting paid the full amount. Giannis Varoufakis.
Yeah.
He's a guy from Greece.
He was the Treasury Secretary. What was his position? He had a cabinet position in the Syriza government that got elected to Greece in 2011 in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis.
I was just listening to him talk about how we've left capitalism and now we're into techno-feudalism, right? and we generate capital for Google just by having our phones on and walking around. That like replenishes their coffers basically. Where it used to be that capital was generated like by industry and mills and whatnot, and then before that, what mattered was having whoever had the most land could go grow the most food. Like that's where like power came from. But now we're into this techno feudalism. Well, Giannis was saying how like the American dollar is still like probably not going anywhere. So I guess the BRICS system was invented by Goldman Sachs.
Oh, really? I did not know that. That's interesting. Varoufakis said that.
Yeah,
the finance minister. Huh.
And that South Africa was added to it. So because otherwise it would have been BRIC, and that didn't sound good enough. And well, I mean, I've heard a lot of people talk about how I guess China is not doing that well. I guess they have like demographic issues, is what people say. And I don't know, that maybe like the American, the status quo really isn't going to change, especially soon. Well, we've just started this era of techno feudalism. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think that things will change. Ultimately, well, what I'd really be interested in is some kind of like personal salvation more than financial salvation. Although I don't really have student loan debt. Well, we've talked about sacrificing goats on here before. So maybe, we need to do one of these rituals of Dionysus or something. And yeah.
Well, I reckon that financial salvation and ego death are two sides of the same coin. Right? The problem we have is that people are sick with ego. The thing about capital is that, and the thing about compound interest rates is that basically the idea is that because you have capital today, you're entitled to a little bit of extra capital tomorrow. And so if you have lots of capital, you can get lots of capital tomorrow. And that leads to a system where where the money flows from the poor to the wealthy. And another way of saying that is, another way of thinking of it is that the longer you're alive, the more capital you accumulate. And so this capital accumulation gives you the right to take wealth from the younger generation who don't have their own capital and are just coming up. They're going to have to borrow from you, and you're going to be able. So what you have is a society society tends to get sick, where the older people cannibalize the younger generations, and that's what they're worried about happening in China. And we have the same demographic problem here, and they also have it in Europe, and they also have it in Japan. It's like no place is escaping from that. When you make it so that young people are all working as basically enfranchised by old people, then those young people aren't going to have babies of their own because they're busy supporting the old people, and you end up with this weird population bulge where you have all old people and very few young people. And the old people want to retire, but there's not enough young people to keep on providing the services they need in their sunset years, and so you have a terrible economic situation. A Christian way of saying that might be, if you don't have forgiveness, because of human nature, we're doomed to an Armageddon if we don't have forgiveness. So I don't know. I don't quite know how to close the loop on personal salvation versus financial salvation, other than to suggest that I can see that ego death is woven into this tapestry in a fundamental way. Like so much of the sickness that you're forced to live with, like think about the homeless people you have to stare at every day and walking over needles on the sidewalk and all of the things that just are really difficult mentally to have to live in and around all the time. And these all have an economic sort of component to them.
I guess we don't have to find all the answers today.
Well, there's one other avenue we've got to go down before we give up. And that's, of course, the notions of Platonism. Because and this was on the pod that got destroyed, or that we lost. I think that I was talking about the Bruins Centennial jersey as a way of getting into this idea of Platonism on the last pod. I was thinking about buying one of those Bruins Centennial jerseys, the Boston Bruins. It's their 100th season. They've got a new jersey. And I was kicking the tires on this, and I was like, would James Bond wear a Bruins jersey? Would he be walking around with someone else's name on his back? Probably not, right? It's not like it's not something that someone with a consummate sense of taste like 007 would do. And that kind of persuaded me not to buy the Bruins jersey. Now, one way you could interpret that little anecdote is, well, like James Bond doesn't exist bodily in the 4D matrix that we live in. He lives in this realm of ideas, right? That he lives in the same place that Superman and Batman and Darth Vader live. But nonetheless, these characters have a huge impact on our lives. People use these templates, these characters, to understand others and predict others' behavior, or they wear them like one of the Dionysian masks themselves. You try to be more like James Bond, or you try to be more like, hopefully not Darth Vader, but you try to be more like Princess Leia, whatever the thing is. So there's this notion that outside of our 4D matrix, there is this realm of ideas, and the 4D matrix is really a projection. We're like the prism through which these ideas are reflected or diffracted into this moving 4D picture. What did Plato call it? The moving picture of eternity. That, I think, is very interesting. So the point here is Jesus might not actually have to be resurrected for the idea of his resurrection to bring down the Roman Empire. Or Jesus might not even have to exist at all as a person, right? He could just be a story about, like, it could just be this Greek story about a guy from Palestine, and that's it. That's all he doesn't need. He doesn't really need bodily existence to bring about the fall of Rome, which is very interesting. So what do you think about that? I mean, if you're talking about personal salvation, maybe seeing, like, personal salvation, maybe seeing, instead of thinking that the universe is made of little tiny billiard balls all clacking against each other, atoms and quarks, electrons, protons and neutrons, maybe reality is actually made of ideas, and being able to get outside of that illusion is where the promise of personal salvation lies.
Well, see, the thing is I'm already like on board with the universe of ideas.
Okay, I see. So you're on board. So what we really need, and this is really what I think system failure is all about, we need a constellation of ideas that'll move from mind to mind like a virus infecting new people and take over and transform our society in a positive direction versus an egoic, and we've got to harvest young people for the benefit of the old sort of ethic.
Yeah, well, I mean, it feels like we need a powerful idea. But I'm just not sure what it is.
Well, I think that it is no longer all that controversial to suggest that there are compounds like the ones that they consumed at Eleusis or in the Dionysian festivals that can aid in that process. I think also discipline, prayer, meditation, fasting, all of these are ways to dispel the tiresome 4D illusion of the matrix that is bringing us down and making us feel terrible on a day-to-day basis and making us wish for some kind of salvation from beyond, from that timeless realm of forms and ideas that Plato always talked about.
Well, those things certainly help.
Well, it's all very, very interesting to see how this has played out before. And I do think that reading the history books is also a good way to it's like watching game film. What happened, during last week's Patriots game. Well, we can use that to learn and do better this time. So we can certainly look back to the classics for inspiration on this front, or you can look to the medieval period if you want to go further. Platonism bubbled up in the medieval period as magic. This idea that reality is kind of like a lucid dream. You're creating reality inside your head. Your head isn't moving around inside a larger reality. You're much the opposite. The universe is inside your head. Otherwise, you wouldn't be aware of it. The what you're walking around inside is really your mental model of the universe, not the universe itself. It's very confusing. But then that's the source of the illusion of the 4D matrix. And magic, really, I mean, the church was aggressive about burning people that made this suggestion. Anyone who had that kind of insight got burnt at the stake. It was violent repression. I also, it's like when the authorities become oppressive, when the Holy Roman Empire has all of continental Europe on lockdown in the 14th century, when we're having to pay all of our money to the authorities because of religious ideas that we just take to be real, but are made up by them, it's a con, to get you to pay them. Well, it's happening again. There is no question that Platonism is bubbling up. There is the example of Steve Jobs, who was so vocal about his use of LSD in the creative process and taking a huge part in the computer revolution, that Albert Hoffman, now a 90-year-old dude, wrote him a letter in 2008 post iPod that you can go online and read. It is really wild. There is the impact of LSD on the Beatles, which we've talked about in this podcast before. No question that those guys were not shy about talking about how LSD transformed them from the surf guitar, or I Want to Hold Your Hand era, to the White Album and Sgt. Pepper's. Absolutely wild. And there's been a phenomenon lately that I think is really Platonistic, and that is the multiverse movies. Obviously, there's Spider-Man Into the Multiverse. There's the recent Flash movie where Batman is played by Ben Affleck, and then by Michael Keaton, and then by George Clooney. So all three are in the movie. And it's because people are becoming aware that the reality, the idea of the multiverse is that there are multiple realities, and you can move around and through them, and that reality is kind of fungible or illusory, or it admits of some kind of manipulation in the way that the magicians of the Middle Ages thought. So I feel like I almost feel like the idea has its own momentum and its own life to it, and that the more oppressive the authorities get, the more that idea, the more those Neoplatonic ideas bubble up in the stew of our culture and start appearing on the surface.
Well, I'd say, well, let's hope that they do. All right, I mean, it does seem to be happening to some extent. I guess what you would like to see is, people. I don't know. Yeah, we should have like a Dionysic,
Dionysian? I'm not sure what the word is either.
Yeah, well, we should have a Dionysian cult ritual. I think it's in order.
Definitely. I think we'd ought to just briefly connect this idea to the Holy Grail, because I that's a way of symbolizing what you're looking for, salvation, right? The Holy Grail is a very interesting symbol. Obviously, you heard from the placard above the Theater of Dionysus in the Acropolis Museum, this idea that the Cantharos cup was the symbol of Dionysus. And of course, the chalice is also the thing that they found at the over in Spain in 2003. Some Catalan archaeologists dug up this ceremonial chalice in an old Greek colony, and I think this, outside of Marseille, right, which is just over the border in France, Marseille, the French city of Marseille, used to be called Marseille. It was a Greek colony, and so near Marseille, at this Spanish site, Mas Castella de Pontos, they dug up a chalice and a human jawbone with dental calculus, both of which tested positive for ergot, LSD. Well, that cup, that symbol of the cup, that cup made its way into, obviously, the god of wine is going to have a cup. And curiously, it's also in the Jesus story, the magic cup that held the blood of Christ. It's very odd that should be popping up again. But the secret, this was what I learned from reading the Da Vinci Code, the old Dan Brown, yarn. The secret of the Holy Grail has always been considered a feminine secret. Why? Well, the idea that you are not really you is epitomized, like women among our population, women alone have the experience of having their personal existence forked from one to two people when they give birth. And so that's why it's always given a sort of feminine. In Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, the Holy Grail turned out to be the person of Mary Magdalene, who herself has a non-canonical gospel, and who was supposed to be the wife of Jesus, and who was supposed to be pregnant with their child at the time of the crucifixion. And the story of the Da Vinci Code goes on to suggest that she got whisked away to, I think, France, and then later to Scotland. And that the womb of Mary Magdalene is the true vessel that holds the blood of Christ, and you can see how that symbology would work. The priestesses at Eleusis were all women. The secret was passed down from one generation of women to the next. The secret of how to brew up an ergot potion without killing the initiate. Right? Ergot is incredibly poisonous. Most people that consume ergot die of ergotism. So you have to have You have to have a really precise magical recipe in order to make the thing work. And so it's interesting that, and of course it's Demeter and it's Persephone. And so it's very interesting, the feminization here. Now, I would like to, if you've ever gone with ladies to the shopping mall and they're all trying to decide what store to go into, it can be a frustrating process because none of them wants to be decisive. They kind of gin up a consensus among themselves with no one really putting themselves out there. It's interesting to watch, and it can be frustrating and maddening if you're just trying to be quick about it. But that really is fundamental to democracy. We've mentioned on this pod before how obviously the slave societies of the classical world were much more top-down and much less democratic than the peasant and lord societies of the Middle Ages, and those were much more top-down and less democratic than the employer-employee society we live in today. And so if you can kind of think of democracy as a feminization, I suppose, of history, and it's very interesting to me that the symbol of the woman with the sly smile, the secretive smile, or the finger put to her lips to indicate the secret, that is an old symbol of this very idea. And it's why Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa as this woman with the sly smile. Like Leonardo understood all of this. It's why he painted the Last Supper the way he did. And that's the contents of the Da Vinci Code. So there are so many components to this. It's like, we're now that we're on the cusp of another great change, like the one from lord serf to employer employee. We're on the cusp of another change like that too. I think we'll end up in a more democratic place this time around once this version of human society collapses and we rebuild the pieces. So that's all kind of a more economic sort of salvation, I think, than the one you're looking for. But these are the places where I think we can expect the future, where we can expect the killer idea to come from. Somewhere in this tangled web that we have spun during this podcast, I think the real key is it's somewhere in there. And maybe just through continued dialogue with each other and in continued dialogue with others, we can kind of sand down this Pinewood Derby car and make it aerodynamic and make it so that it really moves from mind to mind with alacrity. Wouldn't that be fascinating to take part in a mental revolution like that? Well, I think that's kind of a hopeful note to go out on. Brian, what do you think? Have we been at it for long enough here?
Oh, yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up here.
I think our listeners are sure to be exhausted by this juncture.
Until next week, then.
All right, we'll see you all next week. And you too, Brian.
All right.
Bye-bye.